So three of the files shown below in this particular video log talking about place storytelling. Three of the files were school and park site, portions of school and park sites that were essentially repurposed, rezoned from publicly accessible and used public lands, parklands, into private residential development. So three of them are all the Black Mud file shown below, and the Blue Quill sites 1 and 2 in 2006 and 9 were those kinds of files. From 1994 to 2006, we had something called the surplus school site review process. So what would happen in practice is when a school deemed that they no longer needed a portion that they're building on, they weren't going to build a school on the site, but the site was actually had been acquired by the city in anticipation of them needing a school on the site. The building envelope the school board would pass a motion at their trustee meetings, and that they no longer need it. It would be passed to the city manager that they no longer needed that building envelope for educational purposes. And it would go, then the joint use agreement would intake it, so to speak. It would be passed to the parks function that would look at it from a recreational needs perspective. Is there a continuing ongoing recreational need for that parcel of land? While the land had been surplus by the school boards for educational purposes, it had actually been planned to include gymnasiums. Now, gymnasiums are a huge issue these days with the rise of the Raptors and their NBA championship. Basketball is a growing sport. And the joint use agreement basically said the community will have access to the gymnasium. So while education was the first priority for those lands, for that building envelope site, it also had a recreational component. They also would build, the school board, if the school had built a school, would build a parking lot that the community would use. So basically the gymnasium space and even the classrooms and the parking lot would be accessible to the community for recreational or social purposes when the school wasn't in use. So at night, on weekends, and in the summer kind of thing. And in return, so this was so we would co-locate them on the same site as our typical park sites, and we would use they would during the school day, they would use the grass, the playgrounds and whatnot that was developed with the community as well. So there's this synergistic opportunity of collecting these public uses and putting them in one place and sharing those activities. So sharing those facilities, those public assets. In 1994, we began to realize that, in fact, the schools were not going to be able to build as many schools as they had planned in the area, in the land use planning processes in the area plans. Now that was happening for a number of different reasons. One of it was economics, and one was the change in how school boards were funded. So basically, it was difficult for the boards to build the schools that they wanted. They relied entirely on funds from the province, that the province didn't give them the money. They couldn't build a school. And so what was happening in the 90s was we're seeing more and more of these school sites. The schools school board's not able to build schools, so we started asking questions. The administration started asking questions. Well, what should we do about that? And one of the things that came out of it was a process that the city fathers, the elected officials and administrators, said, okay, Edmonton Federation Community Leagues, which is the parent organization of community leagues across the city, how can we manage this land in a way that makes sense, that the community is not surprised, the community is engaged in a process to figure out the future land use? Because by the time a community league is there, excuse me, by the time a community league is there, the neighborhood's built out. So if you're going to take away land that's used for publicly accessible and used parkland, we should have a dialogue about and a process on how we're going to do that. So we did that. So we developed this process that was in place from 94 to 2006, where, as I said, the school board would pass the city manager would pass to the parks function. The parks function would go out and do a recreational need assessment that included quantitative and qualitative assessments of the recreational needs of the community. If there was no further recreational needs of the community that couldn't be accommodated on the rest of the park sites in the area, then in fact it could be used for something else, and it could be passed to the land use change process that would allow residential or commercial or whatever to be determined by council. So we had that process in place from 94 to 2006. What we found in practice was, and we did it 14 times, sometimes they were retained as parkland in the case of Belvedere. In the case of Blue Quill, in the Black Mud case, we went through the process for it. And to me, this whole process, this surplus school site process through the joint use agreement was a bit of due diligence on the administrators and elected officials' perspective to understand what's the best way to move forward on these sites. So we went through that 14 times. These processes could be controversial, could be divisive in some cases. Because of the way we develop and program and maintain our school and park sites, community is intimately involved in the operationalization of park services. So the fact that communities sometimes resisted losing park spaces is not surprising. It was, but in the case of the Black Mud example, they had a process. We went through a process. We did a recreational with quantitative and qualitative need assessments. They could not convince the administration that their needs couldn't be done elsewhere. Interestingly enough, on that site, the community asked if they could explore a local improvement levy to actually pay the city for the site. Now, the land would be held within the inventory, but within the parkland inventory, but they could pay the city for the site, because in the notion is that it's over and above the service we normally provide. So if you want it, you can buy it, kind of thing. Now, they went through a bit of a local improvement process with the community, and not enough of the community took up the idea, and it had to be put aside. But nevertheless, in the Black Mud case, they went through a process to do that, to assess the recreational needs of the community. Interestingly enough, when the joint use agreement was passed in 1960, the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues, which has been around since, I think, around 1920 or something like that, or before, in 1960, they asked to be on the steering committee of the joint use agreement. Right now, the steering committee is all school board and municipal officials. I was at one point on that committee there's a planning subcommittee and an operational subcommittee kind of thing under a steering committee made up of managers. I was a director. But nevertheless, the league the EFCL in 1960 asked to be on that steering committee. And the reason was they were concerned about the city selling off parkland. Interestingly enough, imagine that it happened later. So, and so from 1994 to 2006, we had that policy in place. When the 2006 and 9 processes came up, the elected officials and administrators determined that we weren't going to follow that process anymore. And as a policy, legislation allows municipalities to waive policies, and for good reasons, quite frankly, because if you have competing needs and you have a policy supporting each, how do you make a decision kind of thing? So those policies, which had public support, can be massaged, manipulated, or ignored in some cases for good reasons. But in this case, they had that policy in place from 1994 to 2006, and then in the 2006 and 9 sites, they basically threw out that policy and never to be seen of again. So that's more detailed history of the surplus school site review that I refer in the notes below, and it might give you a little sense of why the community was angry in those 2006 and 9 processes. And in fact, in one of the second Blue Quill site, there was an 18-hour public hearing, and the community was asking for a recreational need assessment to occur, and the administration and through the elected officials simply said no. So these are ways. So in the Black Mud case, community had a way to tell their place story, and in the 2006 and 9, they were denied that opportunity. So I just want to provide more detail about that surplus school site policy and the joint use agreement. So I'll leave it with you. Thank you.